You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 392, The Treaty with Spain. On October 7, 1795, the United States signed its first treaty with Spain. During the Revolutionary War, Spain had used the American rebellion against Britain to attack British colonies and territories. Spain, however, was not interested in independence. Spain controlled a vast system of colonies that controlled the western portion of North America and all of Central America and South America, other than Brazil and a few other small colonies. It also controlled the largest and wealthiest colonies in the Caribbean. King Carlos was in no hurry to join the spirit of revolution and liberty that had infected France and eventually led to the overthrow of King Louis. He was also in no hurry to encourage colonies under Spanish control to think that fighting for independence was a good idea. When Spain first received the Louisiana territory from France at the end of the 7 Years' War, it really wasn't sure what to do with it. Most of the territory was inhabited by Indian tribes, with very few colonists from any European power. Almost all the colonists that were there were French. Spain mostly ignored the colony, leaving many French officials in power for years, even after Spain took official control of the territory. New Orleans was the one town of any significant size in the territory. When the first Spanish commander, Alejandro O'Reilly, arrived in 1769, a census revealed a population of about 3,200, about 40% of which were African slaves. The remainder were primarily French-speaking colonists. The New Orleans population was about 1/3 of the entire non-Indian population of all of Louisiana. O'Reilly had come to crush a rebellion against Spanish rule there. Spain, however, was not interested in displacing French-speaking colonists. It had no one who really wanted to settle there. Instead, the French population and the Spanish government reached an accommodation, much like the French colonists in Quebec did with their new British leaders. After Spain joined the war with Britain in 1779, Louisiana became vulnerable to attack, and also became a useful staging area for Spanish offensives into British territory along the Gulf Coast. Bernardo de Galvez took command there and pushed Spanish control as far east as Pensacola. Galvez also encouraged more Spanish immigrants to move to Louisiana, pushing many people from the Canary Islands to move there. When the revolution ended, Spain found its interests in direct conflict with those of the United States. Spain retook control of East and West Florida, which it had held until the end of the 7 Years' War, and then received back when Britain ceded it at the end of the Revolutionary War. This resulted in Spanish borders pushing up against U.S. borders with Georgia. America's peace treaty with Britain also gave the U.S. control of all lands east of the Mississippi River, meaning that the U.S. bordered directly against Spanish Louisiana along a more than 2,000-mile border. Spain's concern was that the U.S. was a growing power in both population and size and was aggressively expanding its population westward into these new territories. It was only a matter of time before U.S. growth would threaten control of these Spanish territories. Spain needed a larger population to counter this American pressure. After the Revolution, officials encouraged new waves of immigrants. In 1785, it was the Acadians. Now recall that the Acadians were French colonists who had lived in what is today Nova Scotia in Canada. When Britain took control of that region at the beginning of the 7 Years' War, it expelled the Acadians. Now, some of them moved to Louisiana at that time, but a great many others moved to French Guiana or the Falkland Islands, and some moved back to France, settling in Poitou. These refugees were generally unhappy, so when Louisiana welcomed them, more than 1,500 Acadians moved there. Moving French colonists into this former French colony may have created concerns that France might someday reclaim this colony. But at the time, Spanish officials were more concerned about the American threat. Having fellow Catholics as colonists was better than uncontrolled land that might get snatched up by the American frontiersmen. By this time, Galvez had moved on to other commands. He'd become governor of Cuba for a time and then went on to serve as Viceroy of New Spain, which we today call Mexico and much of the American Southwest. Esteban Miró took over in Louisiana, but he was asked to return to Spain in 1791, and he was succeeded by the Baron de Carondelet. Governor Carondelet continued the efforts to attract more colonists. In the era of the French Revolution, Carondelet invited French royalists to find refuge in Louisiana. These invitations came with generous land grants and even paid for transportation costs and basic supplies to help get them started in the New World. One agreement granted every family 400 acres plus a cash bonus of 100 pesos. Invitations went out to all Europeans, particularly Catholics. Flemish, German, and Italian immigrants all took up these offers. Spain really wanted to keep the Americans away. That's why they kept the Mississippi River closed to all American commercial traffic. American frontier communities had no other good way to get their products to market. By shutting down the option of the Mississippi River, Spanish authorities hoped to discourage Western expansion in America and therefore slow down the inevitable border disputes that were going to arise at some point. New Orleans continued to grow at a rapid rate. In 1788, however, a fire swept through New Orleans, destroying virtually every building in the town. The fire also destroyed all of the food, meaning that the population was homeless and starving. Governor Miró dropped his orders to block American commerce. He sent out word that trade was welcome from American shipping, both from the East Coast and down the Mississippi. He pardoned those currently in prison for illegally bringing American products to town and sent them off trying to request that they bring more. By 1794, the city had recovered when another fire struck. Now, this one took out maybe 15 or 20% of the city, since many of the buildings had been rebuilt with brick or stone instead of wood. Still, the fire's devastation created more need for American trade. Governor Carondelet also installed the city's first street lighting, adding night watchmen for security, and divided the city into 4 wards that were used to organize police and fire departments. New Orleans came to accept that it needed more trade to survive and thrive. Even after opening free trade to all French colonies, New Orleans was still suffering. As much as officials wanted to discourage American growth by blocking trade with them, they eventually determined that they could not survive without it. Now, officials mostly tried to control this trade with tariffs for any vessels using the Mississippi River. Spain controlled both banks of the Mississippi below the Ohio and imposed a fee on any boats or rafts carrying cargo. These fees could be up to 25% of the cargo's value. Attempts to evade these tariffs could result in fines, jail, or confiscation of all cargo. I should also mention that King Charles III of Spain died in 1788, leading to the reign of his son Charles IV. The younger Charles was not as active in leading Spain as was his father, and did not demand such a confrontational policy against America. However, he mostly left his policies up to his ministers, particularly relying on Foreign Minister Manuel de Godoy for matters involving America. Spain liked having the benefits of trade with frontier settlements along the Mississippi. What they did not like was the fact that these settlements represented U.S. expansion and a long-term threat to Spanish control of Louisiana. To break this threat while keeping the trade benefits, Spain embarked on a plan to break off the western states from the eastern states so that these western areas would become more dependent on Spain. The key to their plan was an American, James Wilkinson. I've talked about Wilkinson's history in past episodes. He was that up-and-coming Continental officer in the Revolutionary War who by 1777 was a 20-year-old colonel breveted to brigadier general. But his role as an aide to Horatio Gates came to an end when his gossip revealed the Conway Cabal. Later, Congress appointed him clothier general, but his poor performance forced his resignation from that role in 1781. Wilkinson briefly served as a general in the Pennsylvania militia, but then moved to Kentucky after the war. He played an active role in separating Kentucky from Virginia and also was a leading voice against ratifying the U.S. Constitution. Before the Constitutional Convention completed its work and the Confederation Congress was falling apart, America's future looked really bleak. over 1785, 1786, John Jay, as the Confederation's Secretary for Foreign Affairs, tentatively agreed to a treaty with Spain that would have prevented American use of the Mississippi River for 25 years. Spain was demanding this concession for the same reason that the U.S. frontier hated it. Blocking the river would kill Western settlements. Jay seemed willing to sell out Western interests in exchange for benefits that would help Eastern merchants. Ultimately, the U.S. refused to ratify any treaty at that time, but the ill feelings of the Westerners remained raw. So it was in this environment that Wilkinson traveled to New Orleans in 1787 to meet with Governor Mirabeau. He offered his services as a Spanish agent and took a secret oath of allegiance to the King of Spain. Wilkinson encouraged Spain to deny American frontier towns access to the Mississippi River, believing that this would eventually force Kentucky to abandon the U.S. and join with Spain. He arranged for special exceptions for himself and some of his friends to use the Mississippi, essentially giving himself a trade monopoly on the river that would personally enrich him. On top of that, he received pay from Spain and negotiated for lifetime pensions for himself and others who would help bring Kentucky under Spanish influence. Spain authorized a $200,000 bribe fund to encourage the leaders of Kentucky to separate from the Union and form an alliance with Spain. In addition to enriching himself, Wilkinson envisioned himself as the leader of a new buffer country between the U.S. and Louisiana. This country would control what is today the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. After Kentucky ratified the Constitution, Spain largely gave up on the idea that this was going to happen anytime soon, but it still kept Wilkinson on the Spanish payroll, calling him Agent 13. Wilkinson would go on to play important roles in suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion and the Indian resistance in Ohio, all the while remaining a Spanish agent. While some Americans suspected Wilkinson's duplicity, he remained a senior officer in the U.S. Army. In 1795, though, Spain finally decided that it needed a treaty with the U.S. Spanish Minister Godoy sent word that they would like to discuss the matter. Thomas Pinckney, the U.S. Ambassador to Britain, ended up being tasked with these negotiations. Pinckney came from a prominent South Carolina family. His mother, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, had introduced indigo as a cash crop in South Carolina. His father had moved the family back to England when Thomas was just 3 years old, so he grew up there. After studying law at Oxford and Middle Temple, he returned to America in 1774, just before the Revolution began. He received a commission as a captain in the Continental Army and served as an aide-de-camp to Horatio Gates. He was captured at Camden and spent more than a year on parole. After being exchanged, he fought under Lafayette in Virginia. Pinckney got elected governor of South Carolina in 1787. In 1792, he accepted an appointment from President Washington to serve as ambassador to Britain. During the disputes with Britain, Pinckney was unable to reach any agreement, and that was why Washington ended up sending Chief Justice John Jay to negotiate with the British leaders. Pinckney, of course, assisted Jay with those negotiations. It was the results of these negotiations, the Jay Treaty, that finally got Spain's attention. To Spain, the Jay Treaty marked the establishment of a new Anglo-American alliance that would probably work to Spain's detriment. Officials even feared that there might be a secret article in the treaty that agreed to a joint British and American invasion of Spanish colonies in America. So following word of the Jay Treaty, Spain saw itself in a difficult situation. Spain, at this point, had joined in the war with revolutionary France in 1793. Spain suspected that France would be weak and disorganized after the execution of King Louis. France was also at the time at war with Prussia, the Netherlands, several German states, and had just gone to war with Britain. So at that point, Spain looked at the situation as any European power would at the time. Their neighbor was weak, so it was a good time to attack and take some territory from them. Spain joined the coalition against revolutionary France and went to war. The war did not go as Spain had hoped, resulting in the ministry wanting to bail out and end the war with France. During the treaty negotiations with France, Spain wanted the return of certain border regions that the French army had taken from them. In return, French negotiators demanded a return of Louisiana, but Spain refused this. Instead, Spain gave France its claims to Santo Domingo, where French Haiti shared an island with Spanish Dominica in the West Indies. France would now control that entire island. These negotiations, which took place in Basel, Switzerland, not only ended the war between Spain and France, but also Prussia and Hesse-Kassel reached agreements with France around the same time. This left Britain without its major allies in its war with France. So these peace agreements angered Britain, which began attacking Spanish shipping. The result was that Spain was in an even weaker position, especially if America was allying itself with Britain. So Spanish officials were motivated to get on America's good side by signing an agreeable treaty. Now, even before the Basel Treaty between Spain and France was signed, Spanish Minister Godoy invited Secretary of State Pinckney to Madrid to begin talks. Pinckney arrived in Spain at the end of June 1795, just days before Spain completed its peace treaty with France. Godoy hoped to join the U.S. into a triple alliance with France and Spain to fight against Britain. Pinckney was not going to agree to anything like that. President Washington's policy was to remain neutral and stay out of all European alliances that might drag the U.S. into a war. Pinckney wanted a treaty that would establish the borders between Spain and the U.S. and would guarantee free U.S. navigation of the Mississippi River. For the first month or so of negotiations, neither side seemed willing to cede much of anything. One of the big disputes, other than the use of the Mississippi River, was over the southern U.S. border. East of the Mississippi, Spain controlled all the land along the Gulf Coast. Spain had established military outposts as far north as Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. This was about 170 miles north of New Orleans. The area between the Mississippi and the Chattahoochee Rivers covers about 1/3 of the modern-day states of Mississippi and Alabama. Spain claimed that all of this was Spanish territory. Britain had earlier made it part of East and West Florida, and Britain, of course, had ceded East and West Florida to Spain after the Revolution. U.S. negotiators countered that Britain had set the border at 31 degrees parallel in its peace treaty with the U.S. This was about 100 miles south of the border that Spain wanted, and again, at first, neither side seemed willing to budge on this issue. Once the Treaty of Basel became public in August, though, everything seemed to change. Godoy was ready to agree to just about any treaty with the U.S., just hoping to keep them from acting in an alliance with Britain. Spain gave in on just about everything. It set the east-west border at the center of the Mississippi River and guaranteed free navigation of the river out to the Gulf of Mexico. The only limitation was that this free navigation was available to Americans, and Spanish, of course. Third parties were still prohibited from using the river. Spain also accepted the U.S. southern border at 31 degrees parallel. It abandoned all claims north of that line and agreed to evacuate all of its forts in the territory within 6 months after treaty ratification. Finally, Spain dropped its demands for any sort of military alliance with the U.S. The U.S. would not be under any obligation to protect Spanish land claims against third parties, not even in America. There were a few more minor disputes to be worked out, such as the requirement that the U.S. merchants pay government fees for goods stored in New Orleans. The two parties agreed that there would be no such fees for at least 3 years. There was also a dispute over U.S. merchant ships that Spain had already seized, and the parties agreed on the establishment of a commission to hear those claims. The two parties signed the treaty at the end of October 1795 at San Lorenzo el Real, the summer residence of the Spanish court. Some Spanish officials were aghast at the terms that Spain had given away. Louisiana Governor Carondelet was convinced the treaty would never be finalized once the king saw the terms to which Godoy had agreed. Spanish colonial leaders saw the treaty as a complete sellout of everything they had been working for years. Despite these feelings, though, King Carlos approved the treaty. In the U.S., of course, the feeling was quite different. News of the treaty reached Philadelphia in January 1796, and a copy of it arrived a few weeks later. The treaty gave the U.S. everything it wanted, especially the long-sought-after use of the Mississippi River, and it required almost no concessions. Basically, the treaty just sought the goodwill of America, which was happily given. There was virtually no opposition or concerns expressed about the terms. The Senate unanimously ratified the treaty in March 1796. The final formal ratifications were exchanged in Spain on April 25th, and Thomas Pinckney became the toast of America. Next week, we're going to talk about the Yazoo land scandal in western Georgia. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis and Gordon Kemp, and thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters Keith Mello and Patrick LeBeau. Welcome also to Gretchen Altamonte, who joined recently as a standard bearer on Patreon. I also want to thank Thomas Castell for a generous one-time gift via Zelle. I'm sending out my May and June magnets this week. Sorry, they are a little late. There's been so much going on with the 250th anniversary and other things that my schedule is getting a little backed up. I really appreciate everyone's patience. Thank you, though, to everyone who continues to support this podcast. This week we covered the treaty with Spain, often called either the Pinckney Treaty or the Treaty of San Lorenzo. It marked a big win for the U.S. Pinckney came out of it as a diplomatic hero in America. Now, he did return to Britain after his negotiations with Spain, but within a few months he resigned as ambassador and returned to the U.S. to participate in the presidential elections of 1796. Thanks to the popularity of this treaty, he came within 9 electoral votes of defeating Thomas Jefferson to become the vice president under John Adams. Spain's situation remained tenuous. Later in 1796, Spain, which had just ended its war with France, signed an alliance with France and declared war on Britain. This resulted in Britain recapturing Trinidad in the Caribbean and Minorca in the Mediterranean, both of which Spain had taken during the American War of Independence. Because the British Navy dominated the Atlantic, Spain was mostly cut off from its trade with all of its colonies in America. Spain could do little but watch as Americans pushed west and began to populate the region along the Mississippi River. A few years later, in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took control of France as first consul. French minister Charles Talleyrand, who had been a bishop and a member of King Louis's ministry before the Revolution, managed to keep his head on his shoulders and thrive in the revolutionary government. Under Napoleon, Talleyrand returned to his role as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Napoleon tasked him with negotiating the return of Louisiana and the Floridas to French control. In return, France would use its power to protect the other Spanish colonies and cede some territories in what is today Italy. After negotiations, Spain ended up keeping the Floridas, but did turn over Louisiana to France in the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800. At this point, Napoleon had plans to expand the French Empire into North America. The French Navy had been in an undeclared war with the Americans for several years prior to the treaty. Spain knew that it did not have the power to resist the American movement west. Napoleon thought he did. Spain's cession of Louisiana, which the parties called a restoration, was a secret treaty until the Treaty of Aranjuez in 1801. Spain continued to operate from a position of weakness. In 1805, France and Spain lost much of their naval fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar against the British Navy. Spain was realizing that France was not the powerful ally that it had hoped, and it began trying to break away from its alliance. Napoleon, of course, was not happy with this, and in 1808 he forced the abdication of King Charles and instead installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the King of Spain. This kicked off the Peninsular War, where France sought to control Spain and Portugal, with Britain opposing France's aggression. In 1813, Spanish King Joseph Bonaparte was himself forced to abdicate the throne. He took Spain's crown jewels as lovely parting gifts and sailed off for America. He lived in New York City and Philadelphia for a time before settling on a large estate in New Jersey. Decades later, after Napoleon's death, Joseph Bonaparte would move back to London, which did not seem to hold a grudge against him. After Bonaparte left Spain in 1813, Charles IV's son, Ferdinand VII, resumed the Spanish throne. Ferdinand turned out not to be the man for the job. Under his reign, which lasted until 1833, Spain faced chaos and rebellion at home, and it lost virtually all of its Americans and colonies to independence movements. The U.S., of course, famously purchased Louisiana from France and continued its movement west. By the time it moved deeper into Spanish territories, Spain had already lost control of them anyway to the independence movements. My book recommendation this week is Spanish New Orleans, an imperial city on the American periphery, 1766 to 1803, by John Eugene Rodriguez. This is a thorough look at Louisiana from the time Spain acquired territory from France at the end of the 7 Years' War until the sale of the territory to the United States in 1803. It's an interesting look at how Spain tried to control this American outpost colony despite its weakening grip on the American empire. It's a relatively short book, under 200 pages, not counting notes and index, and a good chunk of the book is taken up by appendices, which include some interesting primary source documents. The author used to work in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence until last year. It's an interesting read. If you want to learn more about Louisiana's brief Spanish era, get Spanish New Orleans, an imperial city on the American periphery, 1766 to 1803, by John Eugene Rodriguez. My online recommendation is an older book called Pinckney's Treaty by Samuel Flagg Bemis. This looks at the treaty that we covered today. It looks at the larger picture of how the U.S., by maintaining its neutrality, was able to take advantage of the European wars to get such a good deal. The book includes some appendices that have original documents, including the text of the treaty itself, as well as some helpful maps. The author, Bemis, was a history professor at the George Washington University at the time he wrote this book. This book also won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1727. The book was published in 1726, which of course means it's in the public domain and is available as a free download on archive.org. As always, I've included direct links on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week comes from Benjamin Nadeau, who asks, didn't Robert Rogers catch Hale? This question comes from a comment left on episode 109, which I wrote about Nathan Hale's capture and execution. Hale, of course, we all know, was the Continental officer from Connecticut who was sent to British-occupied New York shortly after the invasion in late 1776. He was captured by the British and hanged. He's famously known for purportedly saying right before his execution, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." I recounted the story of Hale being captured after he approached a landing party from the British Navy ship Halifax along the Hudson River. Hale thought that these might be Americans and was clearly wrong. There are, however, at least two other accounts of how the British captured Hale. One is that a British loyalist named Samuel Hale, who was Nathan's cousin, recognized him and alerted the British. Another account says that Robert Rogers, the leader of Rogers Rangers during the French and Indian War, and a colonel of the Loyalist Queen's Rangers in 1776, observed Hale and, based on Hale's behavior, suspected Hale of espionage. He started up a conversation with Hale and told him that he was a Patriot militiaman. In some versions, Rogers invited Hale to a meal at his home. Others claimed the meal took place at a tavern. In these stories, Hale allegedly revealed that he was a spy at the meal, after which Rogers had him arrested. This version of Robert Rogers arresting Hale was written at the time by a man named Consider Tiffany, who was a Connecticut shopkeeper and loyalist. Now, Tiffany doesn't say how he came to know this story. It's possible that Rogers recounted the story to others who in turn told Tiffany about it. Now, the story I recounted regarding the British Navy comes from the diary of Lieutenant Frederick Mackenzie of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. Lieutenant Mackenzie recounted Hale's capture on Long Island, and local history around both Huntington Bay and Flushing Bay both tend to corroborate this story through local oral traditions. Now, it is possible that all three accounts have some measure of validity. It could be that Hale approached the landing party, that he was identified by his cousin, and that he was turned over to Rogers to be brought back to Manhattan for trial. It also would not surprise me to learn that Rogers embellished his role to take all the credit for Hale's capture. The truth is, though, that we just don't have any conclusive evidence over the details of Hale's capture. We have several accounts written at the time that seem to conflict with each other. I probably should have mentioned these various accounts at the time rather than simply going with the one that I found the most plausible. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.